The Alter Rebbe, like Yosef HaTzadik, had a very unique way to tackle and transform the darkness of our world, which should teach us how to deal with those challenges in our lives. We all know the words of the Shalom, which is actually from our parasha, that all the special dates in the calendar they all have a deep connection to the parashas that are read at the times of these special dates. And that includes special dates on the calendar that were introduced to the Jewish calendar long after the parashas were already established. So if that's the case for Im Kain, we can understand with regards to the special date of Yutas Kislev, which is typically in the parasha Vayeishev, including the first year of Yutas Kislev originally. So we must conclude that the theme of Yutas Kislev is reflected in the parasha of Vayeishev. The only thing is, when you first look at the parasha, not only is it not immediately apparent that there's a link between Parashas Vayeishev and Yutas Kislev, but to the contrary. On the face of it, the parasha of Vayeishev seems to carry a theme which is the opposite of the theme of Yutas Kislev. Because Yutas Kislev is the day of freedom for the Alter Rebbe. And it's the day of Gula, not just for him as an individual, but for the whole of Chassidus. As we know very well and has been publicized. Whereas on the other hand, Parashas Vayeishev is the story of the beginning of what caused the Jews to go into Mitzrayim and be in Golus, which is the opposite of Gula. Starting with the mission that Yaakov Avinu gave Yosef to go find his brothers, where the Torah says he sent him from Emek Chevron, which the Gemara tells us is actually alluding to the fact that the Eibush and Bris ben Abasarim told Avraham Avinu that his children would be in Golus, because this would lead to that Golus. And then, of course, the subsequent events, including the sale of Yosef and the fact that he was dragged down into Mitzrayim. And because Yosef was in Mitzrayim, that's what caused Yaakov to come down to Mitzrayim, which caused the Jews to be in Mitzrayim, which is how you had Golus Mitzrayim. But like the Medrash says, the Medrash gives a mashal, the parasha they were trying to drag a cow to the shlachtois, and he didn't want to go. What did they do? So they took the baby of the cow ahead of the cow, and then against its will, and certainly not in its interest, the cow followed the baby to the slaughterhouse. Kach says the Medrash, it could have been that Yaakov would go down to Mitzrayim in chains. So the Eibush said, this is my firstborn, this is the special Bechir Shebe'avis, I'm going to take him down in a disgraceful way. Rather, I'll take his son down to Mitzrayim ahead of him, and he will then, against his will and against his personal interest, he'll end up going down to Mitzrayim. In other words, Parashas Vayeishev is all about getting into Golus, Yutas Kislev is all about coming out of Golus. How do they match? So the first layer of understanding this is to remind ourselves that the Golus Mitzrayim was not a punishment, and to the contrary. The objective of going down into Mitzrayim was to emerge afterwards with tremendous wealth, physical wealth, as well as spiritual wealth. Because as we know, Golus Mitzrayim Echina Es Yisrael Likras we know that Golus Mitzrayim prepared the Yidden to be able to receive the Torah. So what's the purpose? Not punishment, not suffering, but greatness. The Yisraelim that the Yidden should be in a position that they could receive the Torah at Matan Torah. So now, so this concept that Golus is not an independent and therefore negative thing. So rather, the purpose of Golus is to bring something extremely positive that follows after the Golus. That's something you could see very clearly in Yosef's experience. Even if you're reading the story at face value, at the simplest level. Mechiras Yosef, Iridasin in Mitzrayim, the fact that Yosef was sold and taken down into Mitzrayim, Nigru Beine Basal de Kavanasam Butiritzu Shalach Yosef, looks like it was something negative, because the brothers had malevolent intention. But later on, the truth emerged. That Yosef tells his brothers, send me in order to help you survive, to give you a place that you could be spared in the land, and that you should not only survive, but you should have a tremendous salvation. And Yosef tells his brothers afterwards, you did not send me down into Mitzrayim. This was the Eibishter's plan, and was for everybody's benefit. The Medrash says even more so. Medrash comments on the pasuk, Vayeishev Rabbi, on the pasuk, Vayeishev hurad Mitzrayim, that Yosef was taken down into Mitzrayim. Says the Medrash, Kiv shoin, he conquered them. The version we have on the Medrash is actually a little different. So it reverses the order to what we're reading over here. This word hurad is associated with the pasuk in Tilim, Vayered miyom ad yom, that he rules from sea to sea. Sholat behoin, he dominated them. Like the pasuk that says that he had authority, or he ruled over everybody on the one side of the river. In other words, Shultan Yosef, Kiv Shoin, Hu Roide, the dominion of Yosef, which is represented by these concepts, that he ruled over Mitzrayim. Nilmad, how do we learn it? Me'aloshan Hurad Mitzrayim, and we learn it out of the words that describe him going down as a slave into Mitzrayim. In other words, because the Torah is illustrating to us that the only reason Yosef went down into Mitzrayim was in order that he should rise over and control them. He should be the viceroy, and nobody should be able to make a move without his authority. That's how it is with Yosef, and that's what Parshas Vayeishev is really telling us. The same principles apply to the imprisonment and the subsequent release of the Alter Rebbe on Yutas Kislev. It's not that there was a terrible phase of the Alter Rebbe being in prison. And then Baruch Hashem, after that, there was a good phase of his release. The whole purpose of the imprisonment was to get to the Gula and the effects that it would bring. As the Rebbe Rashab tells us, that the Rebbe Rashab says it's difficult to say this, but it's the truth. That's how it is. The revelation that occurred, revelation of Chassidus, that occurred after Peterburg, after the Alter Rebbe's arrest, was similar to the Gemara Menachos that tells us that you have to crush the olive in order for the oil to come out. And that is the parable, the metaphor, which translates into that the only reason you crush an olive is to get the oil out. The only reason the Alter Rebbe goes into prison is to get the great Gilui of Chassidus that would follow. As the Rebbe Rashab continued, because of the accusations leveled against Alter Rebbe in that imprisonment, that brought out the even deeper part of what Chassidus is about. And the whole purpose of the entire imprisonment was that deeper dimension of Chassidus that would be revealed. Exactly like Yosef. Why is he going into Mitzrayim? To become the Shalit al Haaretz. Why is Alter Rebbe going into prison? In order to be Megalech Chassidus. Okay, we know this factually. That only after Yutas Kislev did the real effort of spreading Chassidus take off, and that meant Islapshus Elikus Ba'asaga, the translation of Elikus into things, concepts that people can understand, because that's what Chassidus Chabad does. And that really took off after the Alter Rebbe's freedom. Not only did Yutas Kislev bring a benefit to the Jewish world, that now Chassidus is at a much deeper level, but it also had a positive impact on the non-Jewish world, including the authorities in Russia. As the Alter Rebbe writes in a letter, the result of his imprisonment was that the Eibishter's name was elevated in the eyes of all of the ministers. And they had to say, this came from the Eibishter. It is bewildering to us. It's amazing to us. And they, the same authorities who arrested the Alter Rebbe, authorized the Alter Rebbe to go ahead and to spread Chassidus, Teres Chassidus. So that's the link between Parshas Vayeishev and Yutis Kislev. They both illustrate that what appears initially to be dark and difficult is ready for the purpose of something far, far greater, which is absolutely true if I'm talking generically about Yosef's experience and the Alter Rebbe's experience. However, the Parsha does not seem to align perfectly with Yutis Kislev. It's not absolutely clear. So for Parshas Vayeishev, whether you like it or not, the theme of Parshas Vayeishev, at least the obvious theme is is Yosef's descent into Mitzrayim as a slave, and then as a prisoner. And all the good that emerged because Yosef was in Mitzrayim, that's it's only going to come out in next week's Parsha. But Parshas HaTorah and the Parshas after that. Now, the theme of Yutis Kislev is it's the time of the actual liberation. So Vayeishev is not yet the time of the liberation, doesn't feel like Vayeishev matches Yutis Kislev. Unless, we're going to have to say, even in our Parsha, even in Vayeishev, even in the story of Yosef going down and becoming a prisoner in Mitzrayim, therein there is the story of Geula. How's that possible? Let's go back to our Medrash. Let's go back to the Medrash Medivra Chazal. Notice that the Medrash said that the fact that Yosef conquered or ruled over Mitzrayim is alluded to in the same word that describes him being taken against his will down to Mitzrayim. We're relating the word hurad to the word vayerd, which means to have control. Move on, that implies. Not only does it mean that Yosef was taken down to Mitzrayim, and later that allowed him to conquer them, when he became the viceroy, which gave him actual control over Mitzrayim. And that illustrates to us retroactively that was the purpose of him being taken down into Mitzrayim. No, it's deeper than that. The same word carries both themes. Hurad, it carries the theme of being schlepped down into Mitzrayim. And the same word means to have control. Meaning, this is profound, at the time that he was taken down into Mitzrayim, that same action, that already meant control. That already meant he's conquering them. Even though it appears to be two opposite things, going down into Mitzrayim and controlling Mitzrayim. So how could it be? We'll explain it. But before that, there's another question. A little later in the same Medrash, it brings another interpretation of what it means that Yosef was taken down into Mitzrayim, that it means that Yosef took the Shechina, so to speak, with him into Mitzrayim. How do you know that? I mean, that the Shechina went with him. Because the Pasuk tells us that when he was in prison, Yosef, the Eibishter was with him. Now, we well know, when you have multiple interpretations of a single word in Torah, all the commentaries must be linked. So therefore, that expression that Yosef took the Shechina down with him must be somehow linked up to the concept that he went down and already had authority. Okay. In order to understand this, we're going to say that the way Geula works could be in one of three ways. And this is the core of what the Sikha is all about. Shlomo Abirabas' explanation is, when we talk about liberation from Golus, there are three potential channels that this could work through. The most common is that there's a battle, and then you come out, and you've won the battle, so therefore you're liberated. Is so you fight against your enemy, and you overcome your enemy, and you're victorious over your enemy. Now, it's not a complete liberation. Why? Because if you're having a fight, you're having a battle, then you must be behaving in some way like your enemy. In other words, you have to be at least using weapons or whatever it is. To the extent that even David HaMelech is criticized, that he did good things fighting the wars of the Jewish people, and yet he couldn't build the Beis HaMikdash because he was contaminated by the blood of enemies. Krav, that's why we call a battle Krav, because it implies that you've become close, not just physically in proximity to the person, but you become a little bit like the enemy. You have to fight, you have to get your hands dirty. Chassidus defines it as follows. That the fighter who is going to win the war, which is a good thing, and therefore achieve a geula, but in order to do that, it has to kind of dress a little bit in the clothing of the one that he's looking to work with, to refine, to elevate, like Yaakov has to dress up like Esav. Now, if I'm getting involved in my enemy's world, then I'm going to be contaminated. As the Navi Yeshaya says, my clothing become dirty. So therefore, even when I win, and I'm now liberated, it cannot be a complete geula, because I still have the scars, the battle scars. I was there, I was in that place, I was contaminated to some extent. So therefore, there's a better way to have geula. A better, a more elevated experience of geula is Pediya B'Sholem, where there's geula without the battle. Why am I victorious? Why do I have this geula? Because I'm so powerful and I'm so elevated. To the extent that the enemies are naturally afraid. I'm not in the battleground face to face, shoulder to shoulder with the enemy. I'm standing from such a vantage point of strength that the enemy dissolves automatically, and therefore there's no real battle in the classical sense. I don't enter his world, I don't get dirty in his nonsense. In spiritual terms, this typically relates to Torah learning. Torah doesn't get engaged in the nitty-gritty, the dirt of the world. But the Eibishter compares his words to fire, to which the Chazal tell us, in the same way as fire can never be contaminated by impurity, Torah is aloof, it's removed, cannot be contaminated by the impurities of the world. The only downside is, in this kind of success, in this kind of liberation, where I'm so powerful that they just shrink into the background, nevertheless, in their world, those enemies are still players. They still have might. Just they don't touch me, but they still exist. They still have agency. And that therefore leaves the possibility that if I let my guard down, or if I am weaker at some point, they could emerge again strong. Even though I, as an individual, not having had to have the war, I'm living in complete geula. That just means that my world is protected right now. No enemies can breach my world. But I didn't change the world out there. I didn't turn the enemy around. I haven't brought geula to the broader world. So I'm protected. I am free of any contamination. The world is still a challenging place. Therefore, the ultimate state is that even though, yes, I do engage the world in its reality, my enemies in their space, to the extent that I actually become invested within the golus itself, Mikol Mokum, he has the profound insight that is the revolution of the Sikha. It's not only am I protected, I don't get dragged down into the schmutz of the golus, to the contrary, I'm able to turn that reality into a geula reality. So not only do I overcome the enemy and then leave with my battle scars, not only do I remain in my protected space and they're too afraid to attack me, I turn them around. I transform the golus into geula. Then it's a complete geula. There's no possibility of a recurring golus because there is no golus to recur. I've turned it into geula. There's no more darkness. It's all light. That's the meaning of the pasuk that we always associate with Yutis Kislev, where David HaMelech says, I redeemed my soul in peace, mikrovli, from a battle. It acknowledges that there is a battle and at close quarters. It's the kind of battle where you actually are in the reality of Golus. And yet, The geula that follows is completely peaceful. What does that mean, peaceful? Because the level from which I'm achieving this geula is a level that was never relevant to Golus, so Golus was never relevant to it. And therefore it has the capacity to turn the Golus into geula, because it does not read Golus, it doesn't consider Golus, it doesn't allow Golus. Now, these three different modes are related to the three primary people we're talking about at this period in history. So the three levels we've just described, first level is how the Shvatim operated, the second level is how the Avos operated, and Yosef operated at the higher level. As we well know, the Shvatim were shepherds. They spent time in the field, in seclusion, away from the mayhem of the world, that the world should not interfere with their connection to Hashem. In other words, if they would go into the world, they would have come out with battle scars, so they stayed out of the world. To understand this in a deeper way, at the level of the Shvatim, who operate as a vehicle for godliness within the reality of Bria, dedication to Hashem, the world is a real challenge, a real thing, real entity. So if the world is a real entity to consider, so then if you go into that world, you are not able to retain your absolute dedication to Hashem as if you're a divine vehicle once you're in the world, because the world also has considerations. Safest bet, stay away from the world so you don't get scarred. Whereas if you come from the perspective of the Avos, they're a vehicle for godliness at a higher level. They live in the reality of Atzilus, where there's nothing else besides Hashem. Nothing else can be in that environment. Even though they're physically in the world, they don't engage the world in a personal way at all. Therefore, the world doesn't distract them. The world doesn't interfere with the connection to the Eibusher. The world is irrelevant. But how much can they transform the world? Not really. So therefore, the mighty Mizeh Dargas Abidose Shel Yosef. Beyond that is the Madrega of Yosef Tzadik Elyon. On the one hand, if you read Yosef's story, he is completely engaged in the reality of the world. While he's involved in the world, as the Mitzvah Rebbe said, it took a tremendous amount of effort. Especially when you consider he's a king. Where you see that he's the ultimate authority, nobody can move without him. He has to make all the big decisions, he's running the entire country. It's a tremendous amount of energy and investment. Particularly during the famine years, where he had to distribute food, not just to the locals, but to everybody in the region. So he's completely invested in the reality of the world on the one hand. The truth is, even before things became that intense, as soon as he got into Mitzrayim, when he was the slave of Potiphar, he was caught up with running Potiphar's household. When he was a prisoner, the prison chief put all the prisoners under Yosef's administration. Everything that happened in the prison, he ran it. And yet we think of any of these things, we would be so worn out, we would be so distracted, we would be so depleted. How would we be able to connect to the Eibusher? Yosef made no drop of interference to his connection to Hashem. Even while he's getting his hands dirty in the realities of Mitzrayim Ervas Haaretz, he's completely connected to the Eibusher. How come? Because Yosef experienced the divine revelation, the divine energy that is completely beyond the reality of the world. From this perspective, you can't even use the language that the world doesn't occupy your attention. Because the world doesn't exist in your reality, you could be completely invested in the world and it's fine. You could be completely invested in the world and it doesn't distract you at all from your connection to the Eibishter. Reason being, because the connection to the Eibishter is felt in whatever you're doing, wherever you're doing it. So that Yosef has this paradoxical reality where within the world, living in the limitations of the world, taking the responsibilities for the world, he's completely connected to the Eibishter who is beyond the world completely. Where do you see this? So here's the paradox of Yosef's life. We see this. On the one hand, Yosef is a slave to Potiphar, not a servant, not an employee, a slave. Vayar adoinov, and his master sees that the Eibishter is with him. Whatever he does, the Eibishter grants him success. In other words, he's in the same place where his reality is that Potiphar is his master. And yet simultaneously, that same master sees with his own eyes that the Eibishter is with Yosef. And the same thing, and perhaps even more dramatically, is when he's a prisoner. He's a prisoner. And the Eibishter is with him. And the Eibishter gives him kindness. And he has grace in the eyes of the prison chief. In the same prison where Yosef is the prisoner, the person who's in charge of the prisoners, recognizes that Eibishter is with Yosef. Absolute paradox. He's completely in the world. The world has control over him. He can't move. He's not a free agent. And simultaneously, the Eibishter is with him in a way that is obvious to all. Now we can understand why when the Medrash looks at those words, that Yosef was taken down to Mitzrayim, what does the Medrash say? Kiv shoin, he conquered them. V'yered miyom ad yom, he had authority from sea to sea. And now we can obviously appreciate why the Medrash links that to Hurad Mitzrayim. Means he took the Shekhinah down to Mitzrayim with him. When Yosef was physically taken down into Mitzrayim, which also affected him spiritually, that he had to leave the beautiful, pristine environment of his father Yaakov and be in this contaminated cesspool of Mitzrayim. Even there, what does he bring with him? What's his reality? Shechina. In the reality of being dragged down into Mitzrayim, he's conquering them. He's got the Eibishter with him. Because when Yosef reaches Mitzrayim, Mitzrayim changes fundamentally. When Yosef arrives in Mitzrayim, the most contaminated place on earth, starts to feel Elikus. And that happens immediately, the second that Yosef gets there, long before he has authority. How do we know? Because the Pasuk tells us, that straight away, Potiphar can tell that the Eibishter is with him. That's why he gave him free reign to control his household. And the same thing happened when he was in prison. Now, in other words, the Medrash reveals to us that when the Torah told us that Yosef went down to Mitzrayim, Pirusha Binyoni, you know what it really means? Kiv shoin, it means that he took over Mitzrayim immediately. It became a place that is sensitive to likus. Compared to the pasuk in Tehillim that says he'll rule from sea to sea. So Yosef's story is not that after the Golus was over, then he experienced Geula. Yosef's story is the second he got there, he brought likus to the place. There is no concept of Golus. We see a similar theme with Alter Rebbe's experience. There's no question when Alter Rebbe was in prison, he was in that reality. He didn't in any way mitigate the severity of his experience. As Alter Rebbe said, he could have just passed his hand over his face, over his forehead, and the whole prison would have disappeared. He didn't cause the prison to burn down to the ground, which he could have. And his experience in the prison was they interrogated him about some core principles of Yiddishkeit. And he gave them long explanations. In other words, he's kind of experiencing being a true interrogated prisoner. And explain things in such a way that their verstopte Kep could actually understand what he was talking about. So on the one hand, Alter Rebbe is truly in the prison and in the experience of being a prisoner. But on the other hand, the Alter Rebbe was not bound by that reality. Like the Frierdiker Rebbe says, every step of the imprisonment was completely signed off by the Alter Rebbe, in other words, with his permission. And the Frierdiker Rebbe says clearly, if the Alter Rebbe did not want, they could never have imprisoned him. The proof is the journey to Peterburg. That Erev Shabbos on Erev Shabbos a black carriage broke down, and the 4 horses that were attached to it to pull it couldn't help. Why? Because the Alter Rebbe did not want to travel at that point. And so therefore, the best way to define the Alter Rebbe being in prison is like a person choosing to be in a particular outfit. That the Alter Rebbe chose not to use supernatural means, but to allow himself to be invested in the reality of the natural process. And we know because it's brought elsewhere in Chassidus, any time that a person self-restrains, it's not a true limitation, because it's me, I'm completely in control. True limitation is imposed by something or some force outside of the person. But any time there's a limitation where the person chose to restrict themselves, it's completely within his domain, within his choice, and therefore it's not true restriction. So the Alter Rebbe in prison by his own choice means he's in the prison and not bound by the prison simultaneously. How is it possible that the Alter Rebbe could accommodate these two paradoxical realities simultaneously? Move on. The Rabbi explain why that is. Because the Alter Rebbe was an individual connected to his essence, meaning he's unwavering. Who the Alter Rebbe is who he is. Be'etzem. There's no facade. There's no shift. The essence never changes, so a person who is completely resonant with their essence, they never change, regardless of the time or the place in which they find themselves. Therefore, even when he's in prison, and even when the imprisonment is so real as it appears, at least to us, he was able to have positive impact on those same authorities who were holding him prisoner, that they, from their reality's perspective, should release him in the gentlest, most peaceful way, recognizing that he is a man of God. And the Alter Rebbe tells us this in great detail in his famous letter post Yutas Kislev. That Eibusha did amazing things on earth. That it elevated Eibusha's name not only broadly across the country, but specifically in the eyes of those who were running the government, including the highest authorities. That they were completely astounded by what happened. And they said, this is from the Eibusha and it is amazing to us. That at the time that the Alter Rebbe was under their jurisdiction, the authorities, including the king himself, saw that is a tremendously wise person, but more importantly, a man of God. And that is the uniqueness of Yutas Kislev. Not just that the Alter Rebbe was released, not just that the Alter Rebbe was released without conflict, but that they recognize the Golus changed, like Yosef changed Mitzrayim. That just like Yosef, as soon as he went down into prison, as soon as he went down into Mitzrayim, he already had the upper hand, he already had control, he already had influence, he was already transforming that world. The Alter Rebbe the same. Whenever you have a concept, you truly understand the concept when you understand what Torah sheds light on in that concept. But the same applies here. The fact that the Alter Rebbe had such a radically different experience of Geula is related to the radically different kind of Torah that he brought to the Jewish world. And most specifically we'll identify this in Tanya, which of course is the Alter Rebbe's magnum opus. But specifically to Yutas Kislev, we know that Tanya was completed 2 years before the Alter Rebbe's imprisonment, and the Geula of Yutas Kislev is attributed to the incredible passion and energy that Tanya brought to the Chassidim for those 2 years. Which explains also why the Alter Rebbe pushed to have the publication of Tanya before Yutas Kislev 2 years earlier. What does that mean? What's Tanya bringing to the party, bringing to the Jewish world that is so revolutionary, like the Alter Rebbe's influence over his prison environment that is so revolutionary? So let's first just give some context over here. The way we have Tanya, Shara HaYichud Vaymuna is the second of the 5 segments of Tanya. But Chassidim tell the story that originally the Alter Rebbe intended to make Shara HaYichud Vaymuna the first part of Tanya. That's why you find in the introduction to Shara Yichud Vaymuna, which is called Chinuch Katan, a number of times where he references things that will be explained in the future, whereas when you actually look at these things he's referring to that he'll explain in the future, they already appear in the Likutei Amarim in the first part of Tanya. How? Because originally Shara Yichud Vaymuna was going to be the first part. But what's interesting is he never edited that. Yes, okay. The fact that the Alter Rebbe left those as future tense verbs, and we know how precise the Alter Rebbe was in the language of Tanya. And he didn't, once he switched around the order of Tanya, change it to say, as was already explained in the Likutei Amarim. That indicates that even after the Alter Rebbe chose this order, where Shara Yichud Vaymuna would be the second segment of Tanya, he still left the possibility of his original thinking of a Shara Yichud Vaymuna. And basically, the Alter Rebbe wanted us to know that in certain elements, Shara HaYichud Vaymuna is actually the first step of Tanya. Many elements it's not, but there's certain elements that it's the first aspect of Tanya, which means that the way that a person develops themselves in the connection to the Eibishter is in order for a person to reach and experience true love and awe of the Eibishter, which is the theme of the first part of Tanya. The first thing that the person has to have is a very grounded faith in the Eibishter, which is Shara Yichud. As the Alter Rebbe actually says in the introduction to Shara Yichud, you can't really have a profound connection emotionally to the Eibishter without a very deep understanding and appreciation and faith in the Eibishter. For that reason, we could say that the uniqueness of the Alter Rebbe's imprisonment, but more importantly, his redemption, the key to understanding the Alter Rebbe's revolutionary Geula lies in Shara HaYichud Vaymuna, which in certain respects is the foundation of the whole of Tanya. Generally, Shara HaYichud Vaymuna is revolutionary insights, but there are 2 key elements that are, like you could say, the core teachings of Shara Yichud Vaymuna. Number 1 is Aleph Abir Be'Pir Shabal Shem Tel HaPasuk Lo'elim Abayit Vorchen Nitzav Hashamayim. So the Pasuk tells us that the Eibishter's words stand in the heavens. The Medrash, based on that, tells us that the creation is made out of the words that the Eibishter used, and the Baal Shem Tov explains it to mean Shedvorcha Shamarti Yehirakia. The words that the Eibishter said, Yehirakia, Teves Vos Yesele Nitzavos V'Imdos Lo'elim B'Tech Rikia Hashamayim Lach Yosef. That those are the letters that live in the Rekia in order to keep it in existence and to keep it alive. And then the Alter Rebbe explains that if those letters would at any time leave, then everything would disappear and would be like it had never existed in the first place, literally like it was before the beginning of creation. And then the Alter Rebbe explains further that teaches us, and this is the Chiddush here, therefore, every single thing that exists and believes itself to be real and independent is actually considered like absolute nothing compared to the energy that makes it exist. Because obviously without that energy, it would be absolutely nothing. So that's the first Chiddush. Not only is the Eibusher using his words to keep everything alive, but the second those words would chas v'shalom disappear, everything would disappear. And therefore, everything is really like nothing. Beis, the second radical Chiddush of Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah is Sha'atzimtzum Einoi Kipshutoi. The fact that the Eibusher applied a tzimtzum filtration process in order to create, it's not literally that the Eibusher disappears or is limited. That the Eibusher removed his reality from the world. But rather the Eibusher is directly invested and involved in every single thing that happens in the highest and the lowest realms. So now we could say that this explanation, that tzimtzum, which so many scholars took as quite literal, that the Eibusher has stepped back from the world, is not the case, and the Eibusher is constantly involved in every element of the world. That concept, that tzimtzum cannot be literal, is a direct continuation of understanding the revolution of what the Baal Shem Tov tells us about how the Eibusher keeps the world alive. Now, most of us think that the big deal that the Baal Shem Tov is teaching us is that you need the Eibusher's input, you need the Eibusher's words of creation at every single nanosecond in order for creation to exist. That's true, but that's not the only thing. But the Alter Rebbe tells us that those letters and those words, they are invested in, they are immersed in the world itself. And the same thing applies to all creations. Whatever words are used, or letters are used, or combinations of letters are used in order to create, those combinations of letters are completely invested within the physicality of that particular creation. As the Alter Rebbe goes into a lot of detail about this. Every single entity that exists has its soul. Even things that are not listed by name in the 10 statements of creation, there is an energy from Hashem that filters down into these things in order to help them exist, going through many, many different layers and levels. In various forms of code, whether it's the way that letters interchange, whether it's gematria values of letters, to the extent that it could actually be so limited and so downgraded to actually make that item exist, that item that is not even on the list of the 10 Mamores. Claiming, in other words, what's the big chiddush here? It's not to say that the Eibusher keeps the world alive, every single existence, every single creation, every single detail alive. That's true, that's not the message. Because that could give you the impression, and those things are separate from the Eibusher. The Eibusher is sending them energy. Rather, the Alter Rebbe wants us to know that the Baal Shem Tov's teaching is that divine energy is ingrained in, invested in, clothed in the reality of that physical thing where it is. To the extent that the life force of every single creation is the spark of divinity in it. Therefore you can understand that's why everything that appears to us to exist independently is actually like absolute nothing. It's really nothing compared to the energy that's keeping it alive. Now that should give you the impression that, hang on a second, the bittul that this creation has is, maybe it's not complete. Seeing as the package of divine energy which is inside this creation is something that has been so downgraded, so limited, to be relevant and relative to the thing it has to enliven. So, well, surely, if I take into consideration the thing I'm giving energy to, surely that thing exists. Surely it has an identity. Surely it's not completely bottled. Therefore, the Alter Rebbe has to explain. There is no such thing as tzimtzum in the real, literal sense. Meaning, that means that even in a reality where the divine energy has been so limited so as to fit into this reality, this entity, that doesn't mean that the Eibishter's fullest essence is not there. And the Eibishter's essence fills every speck of existence. Which means that there is the paradox, similar to the paradox we've discussed with Yosef and with Alter Rebbe in prison. On the one hand, every single creation has its bespoke energy center, its bespoke soul. And it got there because the Eibishter compressed his energy to suit that particular creation. Simultaneously, here's the paradox. Every single creation is directly bound with Eibishter's essence. Because even in the place occupied by this individual creation is Eibishter's essence without limit. The filter is just for our experience, it's not the truth. And seeing as the Eibishter's essence is in no way related to the realities, boundaries, and limitations of the world, then we can feel, we can experience that the reality of everything is Elikus, not a product of Elikus. I do like the expression used in Chassidus, Hayesha Nivra or Hayesha Amiti. The fact that a created entity feels independence is in itself an illustration of the fact that it is one with the Eibishter who is true existence. And therefore, there's nothing besides the Eibishter. So, like anything else in Torah, has to have a lesson for us. Especially if it's a story of a Rebbe, and especially considering that a Rebbe is an neshama that incorporates all of our neshamas, and especially a story that was publicized. Specifically in our context, why was the Alter Rebbe in prison? Because he had Mesiras Nefesh that Chassidus should be spread to all Yidden. Not just to all Yidden in the broader sense, but to each individual Jew. By the Alter Rebbe having so much sacrifice to spread Chassidus to every Chassid, it means that the Alter Rebbe empowered every Chassid to have absolute Mesiras Nefesh for Chassidus. The way that every Yid serves the Eibishter in this dark Golus that we're in, the objective, the approach has to be that we have to illuminate the Golus using the light of Torah and mitzvahs. Particularly when we're in the time just at the brink of Mashiach. To be able to illuminate such a doubly dark darkness, you need a much, much stronger light. In fact, you don't only need light, you need the source of light, which is Pnimis HaTorah, Shenizgal to be the inner part of Torah, the inner light of Torah, which for us is accessed through Chassidus. Now, because of how dark the world is, it's very possible that a person could have really, really difficult challenges. And then a person will say, We have big challenges, and we're a small nation, a small nation amongst nations. But not only that. Out of the Jewish people, we're in a minority of those who are spreading Yiddishkeit, and a minority within that, those who are spreading Chassidus. Therefore, a person could conclude, let me hold off until the challenges dissipate, and then I'll do what I have to do, because the world is overwhelming. That's the lesson from Yosef and from the Alter Rebbe. We have to know as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, in Shara Yichud, the world is being recreated at every single moment by the Eibishter. Where the Eibishter has no external force, nothing precedes him. In other words, the Eibishter is fully in control. It's not possible that there should be anything in the world which is a true impediment to us doing our job of spreading Yiddishkeit and spreading Chassidus. What are you telling me? That the Eibishter right now is bringing something into existence only to interfere with me? The person sees that there are obstructions and there are concealments. You have to know Tzimtzum is not literal. The apparent concealment is not true concealment. And the reason I'm encountering this apparent darkness or obstruction is so that I find the part of me that is a part of the Eibishter. Meaning, I find the fact that my neshama is one with the Eibishter, and the Rabbeim invested in me. And therefore, as soon as I get into the Golus place, I can conquer it. And control it. And that means that a person can literally overcome the biggest impediments and challenges, and literally, in a clear way that all can see, control them. And each one of us succeeding in conquering our personal space and spreading Chassidus there, specifically spreading Chassidus, not just Yiddishkeit. Each one of us, by doing this, speeds up Mashiach's coming. And then everybody will see with their own eyes that the Eibishter rules from sea to sea. And in a way that the whole world is completely overrun with awareness of the Eibishter, because then we'll have the fulfillment of the promise that the glory of the Eibishter will be clearly revealed for all to see. That should happen with Mashiach Mamish right now.